In 1933, a man named Orville Stiles walked out of the Flagler County Courthouse in Bunnell, Florida, carrying a deed to 14 acres of land that everyone in the county knew had once been called the Ponce de Len Spring Site, and that the county recorder's office had, by 1933, quietly renamed in its official index as Agricultural Parcel 7, Espanola District. The name had changed on the county records. The water had not. Stiles was 81 years old when he bought that land, which means he was born in 1852. Which means he had been drinking from that spring for most of his adult life before anyone outside Flagler County cared very much about what the spring was or what the water in it did to the people who drank it regularly. He drank from it until the week he died. He died in 1951 at the age of 99. He is not in any history of the Fountain of Youth. He is not in the tourist literature of St. Augustine, 11 miles to the south, where a commercial attraction had been operating under that name since 1904. He is in a deed record, a tax roll, a county obituary filed in the Flagler Tribune, and in the field notes of a University of Florida botanist named Harold Creeth, who visited the Espanola district in 1938. And wrote down what Stiles told him about the spring and the water and the people he had known who drank from it. Notes that were filed in the university's Department of Botany archive, miscatalogued under a subject heading for native Florida flora, and not examined with any attention by anyone until I requested them. I was not looking for Orville Stiles. I was not, if I am being precise about it, looking for the Fountain of Youth in any form. I had no particular interest in a legend that every serious Florida historian treats as a tourist fabrication, and I would have continued having no particular interest in it if the archive had not put Creeth's field notes where I could find them. I was looking for the original Ponce de Len Spring, not the tourist attraction in St. Augustine, which every historian of Florida knows was a commercial fabrication. The spring the attraction is built around was identified as the authentic site by a promoter named Luella Day McConnell in 1904, with no archaeological basis whatsoever. A decision that subsequent scholarship has thoroughly dismantled. I was looking for the site that the pre-Columbian oral geography of the Timucua people, the original inhabitants of northeastern Florida, had associated with curative water long before Ponce de Len arrived in 1513, and that a series of Spanish colonial documents from the 16th and 17th centuries, located not in St. Augustine but in the interior of what is now Flagler County, near a confluence of freshwater springs that the 1565 Pedro Mendez de Avil's expedition recorded in a supply manifest as Las Fuentes de Salud, the Springs of Health. Those documents are in the Archivo General de Indias in Seville. They are not secret. They are cited in a handful of specialized papers on Florida colonial geography published in Spanish-language academic journals between 1970 and 1995 that have not been translated into English. I had them translated, and when I mapped the coordinates described in the Mendez Supply Manifest onto modern topography, the location they pointed to was 14 acres in the Espanola district of Flagler County, Florida. The 14 acres that Orville Stiles bought in 1933. By the time this reaches you, you will understand what the Creeth field notes say about the water and the people who drank it, what the Spanish colonial record says about why the location was known before Europeans arrived, and what happened to the spring itself when it stopped flowing, why it stopped, and who made the decision that caused it to stop. The Timucua did not call it the Fountain of Youth. That phrase is European, carried in by the romantic geography of Renaissance cartography, which placed a rejuvenating spring somewhere in the Florida interior on maps drawn by people who had never been to Florida, based on reports from people who may or may not have understood what the indigenous inhabitants were actually describing about their local water sources. What the Timucua called it, in the orthographic reconstruction that modern linguists have assembled from 16th century Spanish missionary records, was something closer to the water that remembers, a phrase that the Franciscan missionaries who transcribed it treated as metaphor or superstition, and that later translators rendered variously as living water, ancient water, or simply the spring. The distinction matters because the water that remembers is not a claim about immortality. It is a claim about continuity, about a water source that had been in a particular place, producing a particular quality of water for longer than any oral tradition could date. That is a different kind of claim than a legend about eternal youth. It is the kind of claim that points toward geological stability rather than miracle, toward a spring fed by an aquifer old enough that no living person's memory could reach its beginning. The geological reality of the Espanola District spring, as Creeth's 1938 field notes describe it in the careful notation of a working botanist who was there to collect plant specimens and found himself recording something that was not, strictly speaking, within his professional mandate, is this. The spring was artesian, fed by pressure from a deep confined aquifer rather than by surface drainage or rainfall accumulation, which meant it flowed continuously and at constant volume regardless of seasonal variation, drought, or the weather patterns that governed every other water source in the surrounding county. Its water emerged at a temperature of approximately 68 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, which in the context of northeastern Florida's climate, summer temperatures regularly above 90, winter nights that dropped toward freezing, gave it the visceral quality of something that did not participate in ordinary seasons. Cold in July, warm in January, reliable in a way that no surface water was reliable. Creeth noted that the local name for it, among the descendants of the original homesteaders who had been using it since the 1840s, was simply the constant spring, which is a name given by practical people who valued a specific property and named it accordingly. More significantly, the water samples Creeth collected, 3 samples taken on 2 separate days, analyzed at the university laboratory in Gainesville, whose results are appended to the field notes in his handwriting on 3 ruled pages, showed a mineral composition that he described as unusual in its concentration of dissolved lithium compounds, significantly exceeding the lithium levels recorded in comparable Florida spring systems examined in the department's prior surveys. Creeth was a botanist, not a physician or a chemist, and his note on the lithium concentration is a single sentence of scientific description, with no interpretive claim attached to it. He observed it, measured it, reported it, and moved on to the plant specimens he had actually come to collect. But lithium at the concentrations he measured, he gives a figure of 0.47 milligrams per liter, which is 5 to 7 times the lithium level found in the most lithiated natural spring waters currently used in European therapeutic spa traditions, is not chemically inert in the human body over a lifetime of daily consumption. The research on lithium's neurological effects at microdose levels was not available in 1938 in the form it has taken in the decades since. But the question Creeth's number raises is not a new question. It is just an old question that has been waiting in a miscatalogued folder in a botany archive for someone to bring the right context to it. This is the part I keep returning to. Because Orville Stiles told Creeth in the conversation that Creeth summarized across 2 pages of his field notes that his father had drunk from that spring, and his father's father, and that in his memory he had never known a regular drinker of that water to die before their mid-80s. A statement that Creeth noted and did not analyze, because longevity records were outside his scientific mandate, and because a botanist collecting plant specimens in Flagler County in 1938 had no particular reason to treat one old man's recollections as data. But he wrote the names down, all 8 of them, in a list at the bottom of the 2nd page, in the careful notation of someone who writes things down out of professional habit, without knowing whether they will ever matter. I traced 4 of them through the Florida State Death Index, Flagler County death certificates held at the Vital Statistics Office in Jacksonville, and the St. Johns County probate records for the families that had relocated to the coastal towns as the interior agricultural economy declined. The 4 I could identify with confidence died at 87, 91, 84, and 93. The 5th name I traced far enough to find a family history published privately in 1967 by descendants of one of the original Espanola homesteading families. A spiral-bound volume of the kind that county historical societies use to produce, and that survive in the collections of local libraries in editions of a few dozen copies. The Flagler Beach Public Library has one, which placed the death of their relevant ancestor at 88. 5 out of 5, in a rural Florida county where the median life expectancy for the general population in the relevant birth cohorts was, according to the Florida Board of Health's own statistical compilations for that era, in the low to mid-60s. 5 people born in the second half of the 19th century in Flagler County, Florida, who drank regularly from a specific artesian spring with an unusually high lithium content, who died at 87, 88, 84, 91, and 93. 5 people is not a clinical trial. I am not presenting it as one, and I am not asking you to treat it as proof of anything. I am presenting it as the thing I found in a miscatalogued botany folder in Gainesville that I have not been able to explain away by coincidence. Because when I try to construct the coincidence version of this story, it requires me to dismiss both the lithium concentration data and the longevity data simultaneously. And I find I cannot dismiss them simultaneously without noticing that I am working very hard at the dismissal. Consider the Spanish colonial record alongside Creeth's notes, because the 2 sources describe the same location from opposite ends of 4 centuries, and what they agree on is more specific than a legend ought to be. The Mendez Supply Manifest from 1565 notes that the expedition's officers were advised by a Timucua guide to detour to Las Fuentes for freshwater resupply on the return leg from an inland survey, and that several men who had been ill with what the manifest calls la fiebre del mar, likely what we would now classify as some combination of post-voyage nutritional deficiency, intestinal infection, or the chronic dehydration effects of months at sea followed by weeks of hard travel in Florida's summer heat, recovered with unusual speed in the days following the stop at the springs. The expedition's physician, whose name appears in the manifest as Rodrigo Villafuerte, noted the recovery in a separate entry and attributed it to the spring water's virtute specfica, its specific virtue. A phrase that in the medical vocabulary of the 1565 Spanish colonial world carried a precise technical meaning. It did not mean miraculous. It meant a documented, repeatable, observable therapeutic effect arising from the inherent properties of a substance. Villafuerte was not writing poetry. He was writing a medical notation in the only vocabulary his training had given him for a repeatable effect he had observed and could not explain by other means. And the effect he described accelerated recovery from what sounds, at 4.5 centuries of distance, like nutritional depletion and systemic inflammation, is consistent with what the lithium concentration in Creeth's water samples might produce in a population of chronically depleted men drinking from an artesian spring for 3 days. Creeth's 1938 notes and Villafuerte's 1565 manifest describe the same spring producing the same category of observable effect across a gap of 373 years. That is too long for a legend to hold its specificity without a reality underneath it. There is a document I have held back until now, because it is the one that changed the nature of this investigation for me. The one that converted what had been a historical puzzle into something with a specific actor and a specific decision and a specific outcome that did not have to happen. In 1947, the Florida Board of Conservation, the state agency responsible for water resource management before the modern Florida Department of Environmental Protection existed, authorized a survey of artesian spring activity in the inland portions of St. Johns and Flagler counties as part of a broader assessment of aquifer pressure, changes related to the citrus irrigation expansion then underway in central Florida. The citrus industry had been drilling high-volume wells throughout the region since the late 1930s, and state officials had begun to receive enough complaints from small-scale farmers about declining well pressure that a formal survey was politically necessary. The survey was conducted by a hydrologist named F.T. Brinker, whose full report is in the Florida State Archives in Tallahassee under the Board of Conservation's Filing Series 617, and whose conclusions about the Espanola District spring system were filed with the board in January of 1948, with a recommendation that Brinker labeled, in his own phrasing, a matter requiring consideration before further agricultural development proceeds in the survey area. Brinker had found that the artesian pressure feeding the Espanola Springs had declined by approximately 32% from the baseline levels established in a previous state survey conducted in 1921. He identified the cause without ambiguity: the installation of high-volume irrigation wells in the agricultural parcels that surrounded the spring site were drawing from the same confined aquifer and reducing the hydraulic pressure that sustained the spring's continuous flow. He named the specific well installations responsible. He provided the drawdown calculations. He projected, based on the measured rate of pressure decline between 1921 and 1947, that the spring would cease artesian flow within 8 to 12 years if the surrounding irrigation use continued at then current levels. This was not a speculative projection. It was applied hydrology from a state employee who had done the fieldwork and was telling the agency that employed him what the fieldwork showed. The Board of Conservation received the Brinker report on January 14, 1948. There is a receipt stamp in the archive. They acknowledged it in a brief internal memo, noting that the report had been received and filed. No further action appears in the Series 617 records, or in the board's meeting minutes for 1948, or in any correspondence I have found between the board and the citrus irrigation operators Brinker had identified by name. The citrus wells continued operating. The aquifer pressure continued declining. The spring's flow reduced to a seasonal trickle in the early 1950s and ceased entirely as a continuous artesian source sometime around 1955, 4 years after Orville Stiles died, and 7 years after a state hydrologist had filed a report telling the state exactly what was going to happen and recommending that someone do something about it before it did. Stiles drank from that spring until a week before his death in 1951. The spring outlasted him by 4 years. The decision that killed it was made in 1947, when a state agency read a hydrologist's warning, filed it under Series 617, and did nothing. Because the citrus industry's water use was more economically significant to the state of Florida than a spring in Flagler County that had been producing the same water, with the same mineral composition, for longer than the United States had existed. The Creaith Field Notes are in the University of Florida's Department of Botany archive, in a folder miscatalogued as Native Flora Specimen Records, Flagler County, 1936-1940. The Brinker survey is in the Florida State Archives under Board of Conservation Series 677. The Mendez Supply Manifest is in the Archivo General de Indias in Seville, in the Patronato section, Legajo 257. None of these documents have been read together before, as far as I can determine, because they are in 3 different countries and 5 different cataloging systems, and there is no finding aid on earth that would connect them except the question itself. The question of what happened to the original spring, and who drank from it, and how long they lived. What cannot be rebuilt is the spring. The aquifer pressure that sustained it for centuries cannot be restored by removing the irrigation wells that depleted it. because the geological formation has been altered in ways that the restoration of surface water use cannot reverse. The water that Orville Stiles drank, that Rodrigo Filofuerte observed healing sick sailors in 1565, that the Timucua called the water that remembers. That specific water, from that specific pressure gradient, emerging at 68 degrees year-round from a formation that had been producing it since before human memory could reach, stopped flowing in 1955, quietly, without any public acknowledgement, because a citrus irrigation survey had a higher priority in the Board of Conservation's inbox than a hydrologist's warning about a spring in Flagler County that nobody official had ever admitted was worth protecting. Orville Stiles lived to 99. He bought those 14 acres when he was 81 because he did not want anyone to take the spring away from him before he was finished with it. He was right to worry. He just did not live to see how it ended. If you know someone who thinks about what we lose when we stop paying attention to what the land was doing before we needed it to do something else, share this with them.